ideas. And we're excited for this session with Zachary. Zachary Cohen, he is an educator, consultant, blogger, specializing in personalized learning, school leadership, and mistake literacy. He is the middle school director at St. Francis School in Louisville, Kentucky. Is that how I say it? Louisville or Louisville? If I said it right, Zach?
You're so close. So Louisville's biggest export is whiskey, is bourbon. So even though it's spelled Louisville, the way that we're instructed to say it and to enunciate it is to pretend as though you've had a couple of bourbons and then try to say it. So it's a little bit more slurred, as in Louisville.
Louisville. Okay, yeah. I'm pleased I checked. Louisville. I love that. Thanks for that, Zach. So he has had more than a decade of teaching experience in independent and international schools in the US, China, and South Africa, and was named an ASCD Emerging Leader in 2020. Congratulations on that, Zachary. That's amazing. Round of applause for that. And you're currently, I believe, doing your doctoral studies in education, leadership, and management at Drexel University.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, we're excited today to be listening to you and learning with you, talking about flexible grouping, collaboration reimagined. So it's going to be over to you now, Zachary.
All right. Thanks so much. Well, one thing that I definitely have not learned nor mastered in these last 18 months is education technology. So everyone's going to have to bear with me for just 1 second as I try to share my screen and get this presentation going. And we're going to see how I do. Let me know. I'm seeing applause, which tells me that you can see a screen, which is fabulous. Okay. Yeah. I love the positivity, right? Like applause just to share a screen. So I think it's a wonderful start to a presentation. Very nice. So as Sarah said, I'm Zach Cohen, and I'm really thrilled to be here, albeit virtually. Today, we're going to learn about flexible grouping, which is a student collaboration model intended to amplify student voice, increase student choice, and empower students to make fluid, learning-driven decisions around who to collaborate with and when to do so. In short, our goal for today is to resolve an old and perennial conundrum within education, which is how can we preserve student collaboration while reducing that headache of group work? So our learning targets for today are anchor to and revolve around the why, the what, and the how of flexible grouping. So we're going to begin by learning why collaboration matters, why it matters now, and why traditional collaboration models are, well, broken. We'll then continue on to discuss what flexible grouping is and what instructional models can bring flexible grouping to life. And finally, we'll conclude with how to integrate flexible grouping into your classrooms by designing an individual action plan. Over the next hour, we're going to work through 3 distinct periods of learning. We're going to open with a period of direct instruction, sort of foundational learning, in order to establish that shared baseline understanding of flexible grouping. From there, we'll take some time to synthesize our learning. And finally, we're going to develop an individual action plan so that we can leave today's presentation with some actionable and concrete next steps. Now, during today's presentation, and especially during this initial period of direct instruction, there's going to be 2 ways for you to engage in the learning. First, you can use the conference hashtag on Twitter, of course. And second, you can use Poll Everywhere. Now, if you haven't used Poll Everywhere before, you'll simply type in that URL that's shown. This is going to take you to a space where you can share the quotes, provocations, or ideas that are resonating with you. And you can respond to the prompt that's provided as often as you like, and you'll be able to see in real time, and you'll be able to interact with others who are present there. So additionally, we're going to use Poll Everywhere at different inflection points in the presentation so that we can explicate and share a little bit of our own thinking. So I'll give everybody just, a second to go ahead and type in that URL. If you're having any issues with it, just let me know. As I said, being something of a Luddite, it might not work perfectly the first time.
I've just popped it in the chat there as well for anybody who doesn't get it if they come in late, Zach.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Pleasure.
Excellent. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and dive into the, for real meat and potatoes of our presentation. So in January 2020, educator, blogger, podcaster Jennifer Gonzalez posed a question on Twitter regarding the obstacles that teachers encounter when assigning group work. Unsurprisingly, clear trends emerge in the replies, ranging from issues of student accountability and the uneven distribution of work to uncertainty around feedback protocols. Mainly, though, teachers express their frustration in compose and balance group, right? A delicate, often tenuous exercise that has to account for academic stand-in, dispositional traits, and social emotional compatibility. I mean, do you pair an A student with an F student? Or do you, as my mentor teacher once taught me, embrace the nuclear option and just put all the F students together? Let's take a look at what some educators kind of shared in terms of the hiccups and the hurdles that they might encounter, right? We see issues of accountability. We see kids doing all the work. Again, issues of accountability, right? They would rather talk than work, kind of the social dynamics at play, right? Something I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with. Attendance, I thought this was a great one, right? And this obviously predated the onset of the pandemic, so maybe a little less so now, but that notion of attendance, right? If somebody's not there, how are they able to catch up on the work? How are they able to contribute? Is it the other student's responsibility to catch them up? Dynamics between students, right? That social emotional compatibility, right? Because again, this is so sort of multivariate and so sort of multidimensional. How are you partnering kids together? And then from a parent perspective, right, this idea of the stress that some of the kids, especially those kind of proverbial high flyers, that they wear as a result of these group projects because they don't want their grades to suffer as a result of somebody else's lack of work. So if we could go ahead and go into the poll everywhere, we're going to have our very first prompt live. If you give me 1 second, I'll make sure that it's actually up. Yeah, it should be activated now. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to go to that poll everywhere, and you're going to be presented with 4 options, which are, as an educator, how relatable are these tweets? Are they A, very relatable? Are they B, somewhat relatable? Are they C, just a little bit relatable? Or are they D, really not at all relatable? Like you don't see that in your class so much, or maybe you have a system that allows you to kind of circumvent those problems. Right now, we're seeing about 67% at A, about 63% A, about 38% B, almost like an even 50-50 split between it being very relatable to the challenges you encounter and, maybe sort of quasi-relatable to the challenges that you encounter. Well, I think that's fabulous. And why don't we go ahead and continue on, and we're going to have an opportunity to unpack a lot of this thinking in just a little bit. Right. So the thing is, the experience that we've all shared and that those teachers shared, right, those myriad, multifaceted problems, right, isn't one that's just limited to a particular classroom, right? We just saw that we were all either A or B. And it's not limited to geosocial demography, right, at all, right? It's not as though my being here in Louisville, Kentucky, or you being in Barcelona or Austria or wherever you might be, it's not as though we're encountering different problems with collaboration models within our classrooms. And what's really interesting is that this is something that doesn't go away with age. So what I'd like to do is actually play for you about a 2-minute clip of my mother-in-law, and you can read kind of the context here. But this is my mother-in-law talking about her experience with group projects at 62 years old.
After group.
Zach, I think we can't hear from here.
Based on.
Oh, you can't hear?
When I was at the.
Now it's coming up.
When I was at the U, I was assigned group project after group project. And it's just so frustrating, It seems almost every class has an idiotic group project. I've actually looked over syllabuses first, trying to avoid them. There is just no thought given to who is on what team. No one's assigned based on strength or based on skill set. Everything's random. And in business, when you put together a project team, you would never randomly just choose people from different parts of the company. The way I have been expected to work on group projects in school is so different from how I've collaborated with colleagues in the real world. I've been taking classes on and off since the 70s. And the increase in the number of group projects over that time span is remarkable. Yet they still don't have any relationship at all to real world collaboration. And with the group projects, I think the most frustrating part is there's always the one weak link, right? The one person who really stands out in my mind, his name is Justin. First, his facts weren't even correct. I checked them, well, because frankly, I didn't trust them. And sure enough, they were wrong. So we all would have been marked on by the professor. So instead, the rest of us had to rewrite his section of the project. And then when we put together our recorded presentation, even after accommodating his schedule, he still recorded his portion while he was at work in his uniform, crouched behind the counter at Subway. Luckily, no customers came in. It's unfair to the rest of us who actually put in the effort. And I know I could explain all this on a peer evaluation, but who wants to do that? I don't want to be the person that throws someone under the bus. So it ends up, here's a guy who didn't do the work, was totally unprepared, yet still received the same grade I did. It just isn't fair.
So let's go ahead and pop back into Poll Everywhere, and our next poll is live. And the question, the prompt here is, how relatable do you think my mother-in-law's experience with group projects is to your students' experience? Right? Is it very relatable? Is it somewhat relatable? Maybe just a bit relatable? Yeah. We have a few in A, a couple in C. It's about 2/3 in A right now. Yeah. And A and C, I'll just read aloud for everyone a little bit of B, but very relatable. Group projects just aren't easy, right? About 22% are somewhat relatable. Students enjoy group projects, of course, but there are definitely issues. And then C, just a bit relatable. Students have expressed only minor frustration with group projects in my classroom. So we've established, right, I think just the poll everywhere kind of establishes it, right? The tweets establish it, my mother-in-law's experience and her bitterness still that she harbors around Justin, right? A story that I hear so much, I had to get her to record it, right? So we know that it can be a frustrating task for teachers and students. There's just a huge number of variables we have to consider when orchestrating group work, but being frustrated isn't a sufficient reason to abandon the practice, right? In fact, it's important for us to establish just how important collaboration actually is. So interestingly, projections around life expectancy tell us that sooner rather than later, humans will regularly live to about 115 years old. Now, this rise in life expectancy is going to add about an additional 35 years to the average life. Now, in many respects, an increase in life expectancy is going to feel like progress, but saving for what could be the 35 additional years of retirement is not going to be an option for many. In all likelihood, a majority of these additional 35 years are going to be spent by adding decades to one's work life. So it's perfectly plausible, even likely, that people are going to have multiple careers. Consider that if even an additional 20 of those 35 years are spent in the workforce, now everybody brace yourself, students who are currently in the 5th grade are going to still be a part of the workforce in the 22nd century. So the students of today and the workforce of tomorrow are going to require skills that not only complement the changing capabilities of AI, but also retain their relevance across multiple career changes. So the question really is, what are the skills that are uniquely human and transferable and enduring? And all around the world, education is being rethought to answer this question. Schools and school systems are pioneering cutting-edge reforms that can help learners to remain viable through the vicissitudes of multiple sustained periods of discontinuity. And to do so, these school systems have given a central role to non-cognitive and dispositional skills. the shift in emphasis being placed on non-cognitive and dispositional skills is being seen in the workplace as well. All right. The 2020 Future of Jobs report found that by 2025, time spent by workers applying manual labor and basic cognitive skills is going to decrease by 16%, whereas the use of non-cognitive skills like critical thinking and dispositional competencies like empathy is going to increase by about 26%. A LinkedIn study also found that 67% of senior leaders identified these non-cognitive and dispositional competencies to be more desirable in job candidates than more traditional hard skills. So naturally, there are going to be certain skills that are going to invariably be more valuable to the workforce of tomorrow than others. So we want to ask ourselves, what's that optimal suite of skills and competencies that we want to prepare learners for that emerging future? And the fact is, there's already plenty of existing research that explicates and articulates and individuates just that. So let's take a look. So we can take a look at the summary overviews of findings across 7 organizations. And I'm just going to pause for a second so that you can kind of give these a little bit of a look. And I think you'll probably begin to see exactly what I hope you're seeing, which is this, right? Collaboration is evidently a part of that optimal suite of skills and competencies that students will need to navigate the future, which makes sense, right? As Paulo Freire describes it, working with others doesn't simply lead to, but is in fact a prerequisite for love, humility, faith, trust, hope, and critical thinking. It's more than just foundational. It's the key to unlock this larger band of pro-social, self-positive, future-ready skills. You know, I had a boss once who told me that it was a waste of time to teach collaboration because it is such an unavoidably human skill. And in some ways that's right? Like we're naturally social creatures who crave community and crave belonging, but genetic drive doesn't always translate into the sort of successful symbiotic partnerships that are needed in the workplace. Workplace collaboration is more specific than that. It's also more fluid and more intentional than that, which is what my mother-in-law was alluding to, right? Existing research shows that students can learn and must be taught to work collaboratively. The trouble is that learning to collaborate is by no means a byproduct of group work. And within many classrooms, we do a lot of group work, but we don't do any collaboration. Now, we know this to be true from Hattie's meta-analysis, which I'm not going to dive deeply into. I'm sure we're quite familiar with visible learning, but collaboration broadens and diversifies student perspectives, increases the volume and quality of generative ideas, grows empathy, boosts confidence, increases higher level thinking, sharpens oral communication skills, grows self-management, and hones leadership skills. And students retain more information that they learn from their peers than they learn from their teachers. And yet somehow the effect size of collaboration is smaller, check this out, middle school teachers, than the introduction of cell phones as a learning instrument, a 0.37 to a 0.34. Now, as anyone who works in a middle school knows, cell phones are many things, but a learning instrument that is more effective than collaboration, they are not, right? There's something amiss here, right? Because student-centered collaborative teaching strategies have some of those largest effect size, like a jigsaw model, right? So it would seem that there's a divide between how we value collaboration and how we teach collaboration. Shufeng Ma, an educational psychologist at the University of Illinois, conducted research in 8 schools across Illinois and found that of more than 3,300 student discussions, students engaged in only 122 discussions in which one student explained and expanded on another student's thought. This tells us that group discussions, right, a hallmark of student collaboration, are really more parallel play than they are piggybacking. A second piece here, a survey by the Association of American Colleges and Universities found that more than 80% of mid-size or larger employers look for collaboration skills in new hires, but fewer than 40% of them consider new graduates prepared to work in teams. This tells us that if school is truly meant to be an epistemic apprenticeship, as Guy Claxton talks about, then we are coming up way short in our ambitions, as these findings tell us that a college graduate is about as likely to be a strong collaborator as a college football player is to be a great NFL quarterback. Sorry, that's a very niche, specific American reference. but this shouldn't be the case, right? And finally, let me just move this over a bit. Thanks, guys. Without a task that requires multiple perspectives, students often simply divvy up different aspects of a task and then sort of smush it together at the end, right? And that's not really collaborating, right? This quote gets at the heart of where the disconnect lives, right? Students are often given opportunities to work together, but the experience is often hierarchical, contrived, and inflexible. Now, this rigidity doesn't allow students to learn when and how collaboration should be utilized because it's often something that we build in rather than something we have students actually make choices about, right? Take a look at Dr. Spencer Kagan, right? We're probably very familiar with this. Collaboration protocols such as this one are the backbone for many collaborative experiences that students have in classrooms across the world. And of course, there's a place for these sorts of protocols, but not really within the context of a personalized learning environment unless we're introducing a suite of these protocols to students and allowing them to make choices around when and how to deploy them with some measure of situational and self-awareness. The fact is that collaboration consists of more than just being in the same place at the same time, working on the same task as others. And I know that for fact because we've all been in meetings where we've been in the same place as others, the same time as others, and working on the same task as others, and it has not felt terribly collaborative. If we insist on dictating the dimensions of student collaboration, students will be trained in a closed hierarchical model of cooperation that's totally orthogonal to the world that they're going to be entering. Right? Every morning at school, one of my just general duties is to monitor our 7th and 8th graders in our indoor amphitheater before they head to advisory. It's one of those unfortunate sort of structural symptoms of COVID protocols. But what it has allowed me to do is monitor in real time what organic adolescent collaboration looks like. Students all interested in the same video game will have a device out. Some will be watching gameplay on YouTube, some will be playing the game itself, and still others will be watching the games being played by others. Students will group, right, like socially distance, of course, and then disband to discuss and strategize before returning to their own independent research or application. The boundaries between self and group and research and application, they're totally fluid and permeable, right? Students will call out challenges they're having while playing the game. A team of friends will call back answers or conduct some kind of quick research to support them. And then once the problem has passed, students go back to doing exactly what they were doing. It's like watching a sentient entity, right? Like expand and contract and expand and contract. And this is what an open and flat innovation community looks like. Collaboration is a vehicle that drives the development of metacognition, situational awareness, and self-advocacy skills. What we want to do is create an innovation community in our classrooms to provide students with the experience of leveraging collaboration for learning purposes, as opposed to making collaboration a closed and hierarchical experience that trains students to experience a collaboration in a strictly autotelic sense, right? I'm doing this project, right? How many students say that, right? I'm doing this project in a group so that I can learn to collaborate. And that's totally backwards. It should be more democratic and empowering that. What we want students to say is, I am choosing to work collaboratively to enhance my learning experience. And it's a rare thing for students to actually say. So let's go ahead and pop back into Poll Everywhere. I'll take a little bit of a break from hearing me ramble. And let me just go ahead and get this 4th question activated. All right. Let's go ahead and pop in there. When it comes to student collaboration, how would your students describe your classroom or your school? Is it that innovation community? Is it more of that innovation mall? Is it more of a consortium? Or is it more of that elite circle? Yeah, a little bit of an innovation mall. Yeah, that's what we're seeing right now. Yeah, so it looks like about 100% of us so far are in innovation mall. We'll see if anybody else pops in to say otherwise. Okay, looks like we're holding pretty steady at 100%. Look at the consensus and agreement. What collaboration, guys? All right, let's go ahead and move on. So I can tell you that for me, I started to move away from the elite circle of model of collaboration. And it was because of something a student said. Like, my entire approach had been more elite circle. And then a student said this to me. So in my classroom, I would always strive to create balance in the way that I was designing lessons, right? Like all of us, of course. Collaboration, Harkness discussions, direct instruction, use invisible learning as a suite of strategies to make use of, to weave this like tapestry of learning techniques that would appeal to all learners. And when I would do this, I would always share with students the technique and the effect size. Like I'd pull back the curtain to share with them and to explain to them why we were learning using that particular strategy on that particular day. Well, one day when I was introducing students to the jigsaw model and shared its large effect size, right? It's the 7th of 252 variables. A student raised their hand and asked, if the jigsaw model is so effective, why can't we always use it? And I was like, yeah, you're right. And that's where this idea of flexible grouping came from, right? In a flexible grouping model, no assignment is explicitly independent or collaborative. Instead, the balance is struck by the learners themselves. So by factoring in task, pace, and level of challenge, students can work independently with a partner or in small groups. Within a single class period, students can make fluid choices about their teams of co-learners dependent upon the task at hand. The organic and learner-driven nature of this system has myriad advantages over the more traditional teacher-led models of group work. Of course, and naturally, there might be questions about how to implement such a system. So let's see if we can address a handful of these sort of FAQs in advance, and we're going to kind of get into the how of flexible grouping. So let's start here. First, how do students even know what collaboration looks like? Well, if there are going to be these fluid organic pockets of collaboration, grouping and disbanding at equal speed, it was essential for me to establish some agreed upon norms for collaboration that were anchored to exemplars and experience alike. So as a class, we would co-construct success criteria using exemplars and anti-examples of collaboration. These success criteria would include posture, eye contact, active learning strategies, and volume, amongst many more. These success criteria were a living document that students had access to and would reference to set goals and to anchor their daily reflections. Now, the thing about collaboration, right, is that anything so human is going to be intensely complex, and the skills needed to be revisited in this recursive manner. And by revisiting it on a daily basis, students could really see sort of the multifaceted nature of the skill. And how do students know whether they're growing as collaborators, right? Well, reflection is our greatest tool in monitoring our growth, right? According to Jim Knight, reflection is a matter of looking back, looking at, right, and looking ahead. And to do so, we enlisted the student, their peers, and myself as a teacher. So in terms of looking back, well, every class, we'd look at a photo that I had taken the class before of collaboration in action, and we discuss glows, grows, and goals anchored to the success criteria that I had co-constructed with students. In this way, students could actually watch their growth as collaborators, almost like a flip book, and begin to see collaboration as a skill that required constant attention and a progress orientation. In terms of looking at, students were making real-time decisions about whether they wanted to work independently or collaboratively. So students were coached in making micro adjustments. In other words, what does it feel like when I'm stuck? How do I know that I need additional support? How can I embrace the discomfort of going up to someone and saying, hey, I don't quite get this. Can we work together for a few minutes? And in terms of looking ahead, once every 2 weeks or on this bi-weekly basis, students had goal setting conferences with me. And these conferences were anchored to our ATLs, which, as you guys know, include collaboration. So students presented evidence of their efforts, and we then discussed what support looked like and what resources they needed to accomplish their goal. And this goal setting was based in Jan Chappuis's work, which is something that we're going to look at a bit later to set our own goals. Now, we all know that middle schoolers have the capability to rise to the better angels of their nature, but we also know that middle schoolers can make pretty poor choices at times. So if you're a middle school teacher, right, you might be pretty skeptical right now, right? Your experience in the classroom might make you a little bit reluctant to relinquish so much control of collaboration and group work. I mean, what if two students who are close friends but do not work well together insist on working together all the time? Well, a system wherein you need to constantly intervene is really not much of a system at all, right? Don't get me wrong, coaching is definitely necessary, but flexible grouping accounts for this as well. Remember, the system is designed to flip traditional collaboration structures on their head by the learning driving the collaborative work. So let's chat about a few features of flexible grouping that actually made this possible. So first, students could signal to the rest of the class if they even wanted to collaborate in the first place. Part of a flexible grouping system is that students can choose to work independently. So students had these little 5-inch paper cutouts of a 1 or a 2 that served as a semaphore to let others know their intentions. A 1 being in front of them or being kind of visible to others indicated and signaled that they wanted to work independently. A 2 signaled that they were interested in working collaboratively, or that they were in that moment working collaboratively and they were content in that collaboration. Students could move between a 1 and a 2 fluidly over the course of an entire class. Second, there was a visual of where students were in their work. So students each had a self-made avatar that they moved from one manila folder to the next, which you can see in that left photo. And each folder corresponded to a segment of learning from the unit. So this way, students aren't constantly asking one another, hey, where are you, with so much of the learning on their screens, but rather students could just quickly glance at a folder to see who's there with them, who's out ahead of them. And as a note, we're not going to get too much into this today, but there was really no stigma attached to a student being a bit behind others, because we spoke all the time about the importance of being a T-shaped learner, right? The idea being that the curriculum is the starting block, not the finish line. So students would explore the learning to find something on which they wanted to explore more deeply. So some of my students who might be by traditional measure my highest flyers were some of the students who were quote unquote the farthest behind. I had students who would do 2 and 3 months just in one segment of learning because of how deeply they went into it. So again, that really kind of mitigated that stigma. And then third, in terms of how do students know who to collaborate with, we had a running list of peer experts. So underneath each of the manila folders was a list that students could fill out if they identified as a peer expert in that particular learning segment. So this way, students who needed some guidance could reference that list and then check in with that student. Now, what I also really liked about the 1 and 2 system is that we have to be really careful to not punish students by virtue of their success. So students who were signaling a 1 meant that they were potentially not open to helping others at the moment as they were focused on their own learning, right? How often do we have students who are kind of out ahead of everyone else and we ask them to go help someone else? It's like, that's not really their job. Their job isn't to be a teacher, even though they can have that opportunity to help others. The 1 and the 2 system protected their time a little bit as well. And then finally, when not conferencing with students, I would serve in a coaching capacity to hold students accountable, right? If, for instance, a student went to collaborate with someone that they are friends with, but who didn't list themselves as a peer expert, or as someone who maybe wasn't even in the same learning module that they were in, I'd inquire, assuming positive intent, and hold them accountable to our system by coaching them into better collaboration decisions by referencing the peer expert list. So for example, right, ultimately, these were easy coaching conversations to have. And I attribute a lot of that to the fact that kids don't want to miss layups, right? Sometimes they just don't know how to make them. So that's where a bit of clear and kind coaching could be really helpful to really kind of reinforce system expectations. And how does a learning drive decisions around collaboration? Well, one way is goal setting, right? I would set the shape of a learning target each class. And then from there, students would reference their stopping point from the previous class and then fill in the blanks to devise a personalized learning target for the class itself. With each individual learning target, students were asked to explain how collaboration would help them to meet their goal. And this is when they identified when and why they might want to collaborate, if at all, that class. Another way was through our daily exit tickets. So part of our student exit tickets was for students to explain whether they met their learning goal or not, and what role collaboration played in helping them to meet it or possibly preventing them from meeting it. So these exit tickets served as some of the evidence that students would then bring to those bi-weekly conferences that I referenced earlier. And if you look at these 2 photos, you're going to see that same student making a choice about how to, or in the case of the photo on the left, not to collaborate on 2 different class days. Now, admittedly, of course, inertia can be very powerful, right? Like you saw beanbag chairs, you saw flexible learning spaces that were designed to make students kind of feel at home. So asking students to abandon their learning nook to collaborate can be a challenge. What I found is that it's ultimately about drawing a meta awareness to the reality of inertia. And then once we had that shared awareness, right, you're prioritizing the path of least resistance and is one that's actively detracting from your learning. We could work with students to help shift their mindset. So students who start class working independently may be inclined to work independently for the entire class. For this reason, we had a saying in my class, learning, not lethargy. The decision-making in flexible grouping is therefore not a once-off, but rather is an ongoing series of decisions, right? Students must make continual choices about whether to work independently, with a partner, or in a group according to the instruction or task at hand, and not the project holistically. As you can see from this triptych on the slide, right, students would work through multiple group permutations in a single class, right? 2 students collaborate. Next, one leaves and another student joins. And then finally, all 3 students end up working together, right? It's a great visual representation of students choosing learning over that inertia. The other way we combat inertia is with Bruce Lee, because his wisdom is always applicable. So
this is what it is, okay? I said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
So another way that I would combat inertia was to remind students of Bruce Lee's wisdom. I would go around and say, be like water. I had a big poster in my classroom, be like water, right? It was a bit of coaxing combined with a bit of coaching, but ultimately students responded really positively to the redirection, as it would remind them to make decisions that would benefit them and their learning the most.
This is what it is.
Okay. And then how is collaboration structured in this model? Like maybe my favorite quote of all time comes from Swiss psychologist Erich Fromm, who maybe some of us are know of. He says that freedom is not the absence of structure, but rather a clearly defined structure within which people have the autonomy to function. I love that. As with any system designed to increase student choice, it is not a free-for-all. Right? There are clearly defined norms and expectations and structures in place. In fact, I say that the merit of this system is contingent on these structures being made integral to its functioning. One of these structures was tag and lit. So one reason why students might want to collaborate is to get feedback. Tag is a great way to give feedback. Lit, which is a document I can share with you guys, is a way to receive feedback. This required plenty of training and plenty of practice, and students could collect and use these sheets at any time. So it's sort of the standardized way for students to give and receive feedback in my class, even though they could choose when they wanted to give and receive feedback. Another structure was our sentence starters for collaborative conversations, right? When collaborating, especially in middle school and specifically being 7th grade, it's really easy to accidentally hurt one another with our words. It's also really easy for language to devolve into something that can be hurtful or just unproductive. So we had a list of various scenarios that one might encounter during collaborative dialogue and what sort of language would be appropriate for that situation. And students were expected at all times to have that document pulled up on their computers, either as a split screen or as a separate desktop. So we had language, for example, for disagreeing respectfully, for how to ask a clarifying question, for getting conversations that maybe had like meandered to weekend plans back on track. And then finally, we spoke a lot about the physical space of the classroom itself, right? We use the physical space, or I should say students use the physical space to enhance collaboration, right? Rather than it being an impediment to work around, I always said that the classroom would be my students for the next 70 minutes, and that before starting their exit tickets, they just had to kind of move everything back to how they found it. Now, in my experience with collaboration, and maybe yours as well, negative behaviors during group work usually would manifest as a result of frustration with not being able to like see a computer screen, with not having a designated role, with not feeling like a part of the group, right? That absence of belonging. And so for this reason, when a student or group partnership would form, students were instructed on and kind of would practice setting up the space before diving in, right? You're gonna have to pardon my accent here, but like Anthony Bourdain, the chef, always spoke about the most important part of being a chef was the mise en place, right? Like laying out everything of yours before the shift would actually start and kick in. And it was the same thing with collaboration. You have to own your space. You have to create your space before you can get into that messy work of learning. And then how do students receive support in a flexible grouping model? Right? Collaboration can be something we seek out, but it can also be something that we shy away from. So when the cognitive demands of the task are too large for any one person to take on, we might like joyfully approach a classmate and begin working together. However, when the task should be achievable by an individual, right? Like when the teacher creates a task that an individual should be able to handle on their own, we might feel really embarrassed to get out of our seats and to walk over to a classmate and ask for help. So it takes a small act of courage and right, like this big act of vulnerability to do that. And the flexible grouping model accounts for this with a very sort of specifically created ask three before me system. So the first thing was that students were asked to check their reference library, the reference library being a collection of all mini lessons, exemplars, and anti-examples that were housed in a single space that students would be able to visit. So everything was right there. The second thing that students were able to do was we created a class Google group. And so they could actually check to see if their question had already been answered on the Google group. And if not, they could pose their question on Google group. And what was great about that was we then had a running list of questions from the first day of school to the last day of school. And kids were encouraged to start their days by checking it and answering questions they could, and end the class by checking it and answering questions that they could. Then the next thing would be peer experts, right? Now, to engage with a peer expert, you still have to get up out of your seat. There's still that act of bravery, that act of vulnerability. But if you're going to ask a peer expert, then at least you know a couple of things. One, you know that your question couldn't be answered by the resources that Mr. Cohen had provided. Two, you know that nobody else had asked your question on Google Groups yet. So there is a natural novelty to your question, which means your question isn't quote unquote dumb. You actually probably asked a pretty good question that other people would want to learn from as well. So by being a little bit more vulnerable, by being a little bit more brave, you're encouraged to do so because you already know that your question is quite a good one. And then finally, if the peer expert couldn't help you, then you would come to me for support. But in this way, with a flexible grouping model, there is so much happening in your class and what's going on is so fluid, you need to be pretty free to be able to move around a little bit. And so this freed me up a lot to be able to go to where I needed, or was needed the most. So when it comes to traditional styles of group work, right, students often have to deal with issues totally unrelated to the learning, including interpersonal relationships, absences, and of course, groupthink. But with flexible grouping, the learning comes first, right? Students form and disband groups according to the task. Those issues are totally nullified. Especially in a middle school, we also need to account for the social emotional aspects of learning. Like sometimes students just need a little bit of time alone. In a flexible grouping model, students can work independently without drawing attention to themselves. For students who may be feeling a bit more social on a given day, they also can scratch that itch without disrupting learning, right? So in this way, flexible grouping accounts for both introverts and extroverts, but also just good days and bad days, right? If I'm a 7th grader and my, boyfriend or girlfriend just broke up with me for the first time at lunch, and then I go back into a class and I'm in a group with that person, I might act out in that moment. Flexible grouping allows me to now make a choice where I can say, hey, I just kind of want to go into a corner, kind of work on my own a little bit today and make my own sort of choice around this. Again, not just driven by the learning, but driven by the learning intersecting with where our students are. And we know that in middle school, we need to find that point of intersection between social emotional capability in that moment and compatibility and the learning itself. So what I'd like us to do now is to pop onto Jamboard, and let me see how I can do this. Let me try to get the Jamboard actually into the chat. I believe that it's actually been shared with you, but give me 1 second. Okay. Here we go. access the chat. There we go. Cool. All right. So great. Very nice. I so much appreciate your guys' patience and positivity around my tech usage. It's very encouraging. Thank you for that. So we're going to take a little time, just about 10 minutes, I think. You know what? Why don't we do a little bit less, because I'm looking at the clock right now and I assume it's a hard stop at about 10:10. So why don't we go ahead and say like 5 minutes? Okay. And I'll just kind of count and I won't start the timer. But this Jamboard is going to be totally open to you to use whenever you want. Just a couple of things if you're starting to open it. If you've never used Jamboard before, all you really need to know is that you're going to click on the link I shared. You're going to add your ideas, either the text box, which is the 7th option down on the toolkit when you open it up, or a sticky note, which is the 4th option down. And there are also many copies of the same template. So really, you're just trying to find a template that no one else is using, unless you want to begin to experiment with flexible grouping. And if you want to put a 1 or a 2 in the chat, you could theoretically put a 2 in the chat and collaborate with a stranger if you wanted to do something like that, or maybe someone from your own team is here. So why don't we take about 5 minutes, let's say, and why don't we go ahead and pop into the Jamboard, and why don't we go ahead and begin to just kind of synthesize some of the learning over the course of the past, call it 40 minutes or so. And I'll go ahead and just start my timer. And I'll let you guys know when you have a couple of minutes left. Again, no rush. You're going to have access to this indefinitely. You know, it's not going to close at any point. And also, I'm here right now, so if you want to ask any questions or chat, obviously, we can do that.
Zach, while people are working on the Jamboard, we have a question comment here about the tag and lit protocols. Would it be possible to like grab those, PDF them, and upload them into Hoover? Would that be possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell you, you know, tag is not terribly novel. I'm happy to share it, of course. What is novel at the American International School of Johannesburg, our 7th grade team created lit. And that was basically sort of like predicated on our beginning to realize that kids couldn't really take in feedback terribly well. So kids got really good at delivering feedback via tag, but they weren't great at actually hearing and processing, synthesizing, and then putting back out feedback. So the lit protocol is complementary to tag, and it instructs kids on, hey, when you're receiving feedback, these are the steps that you're going to want to take to be able to kind of process it in a way that's going to be beneficial to your learning, rather than what most of us do when we get feedback, which is get really, really defensive and kind of get our tentacles up. So I could definitely PDF them and pop them into Wova.
That would be amazing. That would be so good. Yeah, what you're saying about feedback resonates. You know, it's a skill that we can all develop in terms of giving warm feedback and cool feedback, and how we cushion our language so that we can make sure that people are receiving that feedback with the intention that we want, which is for growth.
Yes. And I think, right, a lot of times, right, there's kind of this invisible interplay of kind of like the systems that exist around us with maybe where we are in our particular moment. And that's where I kind of found the real kind of advantage of flexible grouping to be, is that sometimes we try to kind of force feedback onto kids, and we say like, okay, now today is a peer feedback day. And I think my question would always be like, well, why today and not tomorrow, right? Like every kid is in a different place in their learning, assuming that we've instituted personal learning pathways. So we really can't dictate that. What we need to dictate and what we need to do is create opportunities to rehearse and practice. And then students need to be able to take that ownership and have that meta awareness to say, hey, I'm at a point right now in my learning, kind of like I'm at that fulcrum where I need to know if I'm kind of heading in the right direction. So let me get a partner. Right? Let me pop down to 2. Let me see who else is available. Let me see where they are in their learning. Let's go ahead and take these next 40 minutes to just do tag and lift. That's going to be a great use of our time because that's going to help us go forward.
That resonates with me a lot. You know, the practice, the regular practice, and then, you know, the stems, to be able to provide that kind of scaffolded framework for students to go to, a structure that they can fall back on that helps them skill up over regular practice times.
Yeah. Let's take about 1 more minute. About 4 minutes have passed. Oh. There we go. We'll take like 20 more seconds or so. So, you know, just start coming to a stopping point or a pause point, really. You know, just a place where you can kind of happily pick up at some later point when you're kind of revisiting your conference notes. Like I said, this isn't going anywhere. This is designed just for this conference. So you have access to this kind of, you know, indefinitely. And with 8 minutes left, I would like to introduce our individual action plan, but that's something that we won't really have a ton of time to work on. So I'm going to introduce it, but I think before we get there, let's skip ahead 2 slides because there's this video that I absolutely love around collaboration that I think we just all need to see. So let's just like 2 minutes long. So let's just go ahead and just pop in here.
You know what's gotta be done. Move it, move it, move it. Hey, you there, pick up the pace. You're falling behind. Come on, let's go. Everyone move together. We've got a threat to our hands. You there. Here we go.
So, I mean, right, I think what we get from this, hold on 1 second, sorry. Great. So I think what we get from this, right, is that it's simply better to collaborate, right? Crabs, ants, penguins, they came together for a specific task. They disbanded after its success. So how can we create these same task-based, ad hoc, collaborative experiences for students in our classroom? And what I'd like us to do is just chat quickly about this notion of exploitation and exploration, and I'll introduce the action plan, and then that can kind of wrap things up for the day. So the last part of our agenda is this action plan. And the action plan is going to follow a modified version of the Jan-Chapuis feedback model and goal setting framework that taps into the research on the ambidextrous organization that comes out of Harvard. So the crux of this revolves around the balance that we should seek to strike between these 2 complementary forces of exploration and exploitation. So when something we are doing isn't having the desired outcome we want to explore why that might be, identify resources, and see what we want to modify or change. When something is working, we want to exploit these tactics, right? Generalizing and scaling them to impact learning beyond just our classroom. So the process of exploration speaks to a search to develop more meaningful knowledge. In contrast, when we pursue exploitation, we're relying on the efficacy of what our existing knowledge tells us. Now, for both, we're in pursuit of superior solutions to integrate into our own practice. We all want to find that balance between deficit and appreciative goal setting. So for the action plan, you'll start by identifying something that you want to exploit and something you want to explore. You'll then make a choice around the two. And then from there, you'll identify the sort of supports you'll need to bring your action plan to life. And finally, you're going to draft the first step of your plan, right? A journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, but in my experience, it's the hardest step to take. So rather than lay out the full breadth of our action plan, our goal with this particular individual action plan is just to articulate our first step. And so I'm going to pop into the chat the link to the individual action plan. You're going to be asked to just make a copy of that plan, or assuming that that works. And then you're going to have access to that plan how you want it. Again, you're going to kind of start with that idea of what do you want to explore about flexible grouping? What do you want to exploit about flexible grouping? What resources can help you to accomplish one or the other? And then what's the first step in your journey to begin to introduce a more sort of flexible grouping-like model into your own classroom? So let me go ahead and pop that link into the chat. Give me just 1 second. Cool. So you can go ahead and give that a look. And before we ourselves disband and head out to the final session for the day, maybe somebody could just let me know if this worked at all. I quite literally followed a 9-year-old on YouTube to show me how to create a forced copy Google Doc. So let me see if this 9-year-old was right. We'll find out. Okay. That's exactly what I'll do. Thank you. Okay. Give me 1 second, Yasmin. I'll get that ready for you.
This is very kind of you, Zachary. Thank you for sharing all these valuable documents with us. We can also add a link to our Whova app, so all participants can get your documents from there as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, this has been uploaded to that as well. Thank you. Yeah. And thank you for your kindness to go ahead and fill that dead air right there by expressing a gratitude. That was very kind of you. All right, here we go.
So Zach, we are kind of approaching our 10 past the hour mark.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know if you want to finish with any last words before I just wrap up.
No, I think the last words here would be for me to make sure that you guys all have share access, but really it would just be, I think more than anything is there were a lot of systems that I introduced, like a lot of applied systems that were introduced today, all of which kind of extend from those, kind of core 4 tenets of a personalized learning environment. But I think it's also really important to not allow kind of perfection to make us like apoplectic in the face of change. Like ultimately, we just want to make a first step. So perhaps something you heard is that semaphore of the 1s and the 2s, just giving students that opportunity, or perhaps it's just a matter of just having peer experts be able to identify themselves by having learning segments visually reinforced in your classroom. But I think more than anything, what we want to be able to do is prepare students for this emergent future that's really dramatically uncertain. But we know that group work is not going to prepare them, collaboration will. So it's really about us reflecting on our group work practices to ensure that students are developing collaborative skills. So with that, I can go ahead and change this link. And I think you can go ahead and land this plane, Sarah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Zachary. It's been such a pleasure to listen to you. and learn with you. And I'm just going back to the quote that you said, for the students, I am choosing to work collaboratively to enhance my learning. That's such a powerful sentence. I mean, if we just think about that, that really resonated with me. I've written it down. I'm taking that to my heart. I'm gonna quote you. I love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Zachary. It's been great to connect with you today. Hopefully we'll see all of you in the last session with the ELMI steering committee. So stay well, stay connected, and stay safe. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.